All right, welcome, friends. Nice to see friends on Zoom and here in the room. We have about a dozen or so folks. If you haven't met me, I'm Rabbi Jamie Arnold. We'll start with a melody. This is a melody that's a song that the Chalutzim, the early pioneers in the establishing the state of Israel, would sing, and the meaning is we've sowed and we planted, but we haven't yet harvested. Let's go up to the land. Let's go up. Outside. Yallay, lallay, lay, yallay, lallay, lay, yallay, lallay, lay, lay. Yallay, lallay, lay, yallay, yallay, lallay, lay, lay. Ya la 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 ya la 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 ya la 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 ya la 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 Yallay, 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 yallay. Artsa alinu, artsa alinu, artsa alinu. Artsa alinu, artsa alinu, artsa alinu. Yay, lay, 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 lay. Yay, lay, 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 lay. Yay, lay, lay, lay. Aval od lo katsanu. Yallay, lallay, lallay. Oh, all right. Take a deep breath and then we'll offer a blessing for having this opportunity to learn together. And right, when we take on a tough topic, remember to breathe. Right? Remember to breathe, connect with your body. Remember that we're here and to learn with and from one another, and that the measure of success is not that you've convinced somebody else of your point of view, but that you've grown and changed as a result of the dialogue. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Wonderful. Well, great. Well, thank you. Let's do a quick go around of names, and if you offer a comment, got a microphone here that should pick up most of us, but if you're farther away from it, do try to speak up and share your name. Yeah, so we can see the names on Zoom. Thank you, Julie, Irene, Kathy, Lauren, Susan, and Sandy and Mike, I assume. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. Maybe Myrna, we'll start with you.
Okay, I'm Myrna. Do you want my last name too?
Sure.
Goldberg.
Ellen Arnold.
Alice Rosen.
Henry Rosen.
Joe Goldstein. Seth Goldstein.
Seth.
Gary Short.
Thank you, Gary.
Dick Arnold.
Dina Manis. Lillian Gerber.
Ginny Sims.
Bill Hero. All right. Great. Nice group. Okay, so many of you, if I have a memory, were joined us last week at this time, and where we did sort of a real survey course of Reconstructionist approach to Judaism. Some of you may have read the book that is about the Reconstructionist approach to Judaism. And that was the book for this past month for the book group. If you'd like to be part of the book group, you can let Ginny know. We'll get you on that list. It's a great group.
Or Ellen.
Or Ellen. And so what I'd like to do two things tonight. The first is to, for those, especially if whether you were at the class last week or not, sort of to think and reflect about, well, in the learning that I've done about Reconstructionism or the experience of being at CBE, what are the things that are drawing me in, right? What are the things that are attractive to me about the Reconstructionist approach? And what are the parts where I have some uncertainties and maybe some skepticism? And let's sort of pool that and do some processing about our comfort and discomfort with this movement and approach. And then like to think about ways that the Reconstructionist approach is applied. We did a couple of sort of case study things last week, but we'll do a little bit more. And then we'll use as the primary conversation, the content is around Zionism and the approach to Israel, how the evolution of within the movement itself, about its approach to Israel. The Reconstructionist movement started in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and then was already a movement established before 1948. So the movement preceded the establishment of the state of Israel, but really grew up during a time of great energy around the immigration to and the possibilities around the establishment of the state with the Balfour Declaration and starting to garner world support around reestablishing Jewish presence in the land of Palestine. Israel was happening at the same time as the movement was growing. So there's a lot to parse, and then there's some really very contemporary, like this year, controversies that have arisen in the Reconstructionist movement that we can jump right in and play with. Okay, so appeal of the Reconstructionist movement or the approach. What draws you in?
Absence of dogma.
Absence of dogma. Okay.
Or selective dogma.
So my favorite bumper sticker, my karma ran over my dogma. Okay, so good. We'll come back to dogma. Is there dogma in the Reconstructionist approach? And right, good. Anything else?
Keeping up to date with all the present ideas and not being 50 years behind the time.
Okay, good. Sort of moving and evolving with the times as the world around us evolves and changes, to deliberately try to right, the language, draw from the best of both civilizations, right? The broader civilization we're living in, and the Jewish civilization tradition. Yeah, good. Yeah, Lillian?
And building on that, the flexibility and evolution to make the teachings and the practices relevant for me and my family and our community now, and drawing on traditions and making it applicable. I think, especially with gender pronouns and growing up as like my father, my king, and then adapting it as my, a parent to teacher. So it feels much more relatable.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Sort of having a place for tradition and this not just openness, but an investment in evolving and relevancy, right? Good. Yeah, Mike, Nick, Sandy?
So I'll never forget something that Alan Rubin said, and his comment was basically, "This ain't your grandfather's shul." And The reason that it's not your grandfather's shul is because it is Reconstructionist and it allows for adaptation, being more modern, being equal. I like the fact that, you know, it mentions the female matriarchs in the prayers and all of the other adaptations that we see. So,
Thank you, Mike. Okay, anyone else?
Well, as someone who was raised completely secular, never darkened the doorstep of a temple, despite having two Jewish parents, and having, as an adult, joined a Reform temple in Dallas. I have to say that the prayers, the Sabbath prayers, and some of the others, especially the first part of the traditional Sabbath service, it just makes me uncomfortable to say certain things like, Adonai, open up my lips so my mouth can sing your praises. And there's a lot of the early prayers on our Friday night services are all about almost bowing down to God. And that's always, you know, having grown up secular, that's always made me uncomfortable. And then we get to the last part of the service where we meet Misha Bear, where we talk about healing, where we talk about honoring the dead. And in our temple, every Friday, we say a prayer for the IDF, we say a prayer for the hostages, we say a prayer for the state of Israel. And those parts make me feel good. And so I think there's some interesting things in here that maybe I feel a little bit attuned to. I don't know much about it, obviously.
Okay, no, thank you, that's very helpful. Great. Jen? Yeah.
I like, one of the things that I really like, I love, like, symbolism and, ritual in a way. I really like that, and yet I find it also, it can be stale and perfunctory. And one of the things that I liked when I was reading the book was this idea of finding this concept of notion, if you want to use that word, but this idea of finding the essence of the ritual, or finding the essence of something that, like you were saying, something that is long, sort of even almost maybe offensive, finding the essence of that and then translating that, as you were saying, into more of a palatable expression, and then being able to use the ritual in a way that is meaningful and spiritual. So I like those. I like that, and I think that's part of what I'm kind of new to the Reconstructionist movement, but that seems to be part of what it is all about.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you. Yeah, Julie.
I love the inclusivity and the welcoming nature. I mean, I have my own family of origin, which is all Jewish, and my family as an adult of a blended family with different faiths and different backgrounds and different experiences, and the warmth and welcomingness within, to piggyback off of what Jenny is talking about with the ritual of accessibility to what's really such a, in my opinion, beautiful history that we should all share, but making it possible for everybody to have a part in that, in the way that they see and can feel in an authentic way in our own lives. And I'm not sure I really felt that in other experiences of Judaism before I found Reconstructionism.
Yeah, thank you so much. We'll come back to inclusivity. That's sort of, in some ways, the crux of the where the tension comes up around Zionism.
Joyce.
Joyce, did you have something you want to share? Okay, I think she just wasn't aware she was unmuted. Okay, so the two of the examples, and maybe these are under inclusivity piece, well, in terms of what draws me or drew me and continues to draw me to the movement, I used two examples last week. The first was around a Reconstructionist approach to God or godliness. And that may speak to what you mentioned around, for those of us who came from a humanistic perspective or, non-God centric orientation of what, that it gave, it offered a larger umbrella, an inclusion for those of us who were either uncomfortable with or, didn't use God language as part of our way of thinking about the world and our relationship to it. And so there's a lot to say about that. There's lots of books you can read about Reconstructionist approach to theology. The language that we is often used as sort of, we have a Kaplanian legacy of using cumbersome words like Reconstructionist and transnatural theology, which is that we are on. That the divine works through natural law and through humanity, and that's rather than upon it. So it's another approach. The other way of thinking about the theology was this idea of predicate theology, of rather than saying God is X or God is Y, we put God in godliness in the predicate. So you can say truth is godly, and justice is godly, and kindness is godly, etc. Patience is godly. That's a different way of, and that's something that whether you're coming from a more humanist or secular perspective or a more quote unquote religious or theocentric perspective, there's a way in both of those approaches. And they're not just new innovations, but they go way back centuries in terms of that a naturalistic approach. So that first piece was about the theology, which certainly is, gave me an access point as, and then the other was around the language of prayer, particularly some of the earliest innovations of the Reconstructionist movement was to wrestle with and ultimately decide that there were some aspects of Jewish tradition and ritual that weren't reconstructible, that you couldn't, that there was just too much in friction with contemporary values and ideas. And one of those notions was the idea of Jews as the chosen people. And Kaplan found that problematic primarily from a moral perspective, that it encouraged a sense of chauvinism or tribalism or superiority. Even if there are ways of interpreting chosenness, right, that can evade that label, it's still, we're susceptible to that idea. There's an Israeli novelist, I forget what the name, who wrote a book about the Mossad finding Hitler in South America, and so they were interviewing him or questioning him, and they said, Hitler, where did you get this idea of this superior Aryan race? He says, I got it from you. Right? Well, powerful. Like, oh yeah. So Kaplan had that sense of the dangers of it as an idea, and so took it out of very prominent prayers like Aleinu and the Torah blessings before the reading, the Kiddush, right, for the long Kiddush for Shabbat, all had this reference to God chose us from among the nations to give us the Torah, to sanctify, etc., and replacing that language out of this moral concern, which is not only about how we're seen by our non-Jewish neighbors, right? Which in and of itself can be problematic. Oh, those Jews, they think they're holier than thou, right? The chosen people. But also our own, for the benefit of our own souls. So, so Kaplan brings that same sensibility to all aspects, in terms of two pieces. One, I think this inclusivity and this sort of moral, intellectual integrity. That I don't want to say things that I don't believe. And I don't want to perpetuate traditions that I think are not in the best interest of moral, spiritual integrity and the surviving of the Jewish people. So we can apply that framework to the approach to Israel, right? So Zionism, right? There are all debates now about what is Zionism, and for this purpose, the Zionist movement and the basic frame is the effort to have a Jewish presence, restore a Jewish presence in the land of Israel, and through that presence to rebuild Jewish culture, recover the language, recover a part of Jewish life that had been lost or in hibernation for 2,000 years. That's the broadest definition of Zionism. And at the time of Kaplan writing, right, in the turn of the century, 20s, 30s, 40s, so there were two forms of Zionism, two expressions of Zionism that were prominent. They may be, so you can refer to them as cultural or spiritual Zionism and political Zionism. So the spokespersons for those two branches were respectively cultural, spiritual Zionism, a pseudonym, what do you call the nom de pen of Ginsburg, and I'm blanking on his first name now, but Achad Ha'am is the name that he went by and is known by. Wrote extensively. He was from Eastern Europe. He created a Hebrew newspaper and talked about and encouraged the returning to the land for the sake of the revival of the Jewish culture and Jewish spirit. And that was a prominent form in the end of the 19th century. It spurned two major waves of Aliyah to the land of Israel. And Achad Ha'am was Mordechai Kaplan was a devotee of Achad Ha'am. So he studied and celebrated his work, relied heavily on it in framing his own form of Zionism. So cultural Zionism, or some call it spiritual Zionism, sort of values. It's based. And then you have the Dreyfus Affair, and you have the First Zionist Congress under the leadership of Theodor Herzl. And Herzl, who was a completely secular Jew, whereas Achad Ha'am was steeped in Jewish ritual and tradition and study and Talmud, Herzl was a completely secular Jew, and he became convinced that the only way for the Jewish people to survive was for the Jewish people to have their own state, modern nation state. And so that initiative to create a nation state for the Jewish people is called political Zionism, for lack of a better term. And most of the proponents of that were adamant that state should be in the land of the ancient state of Israel, in Israel, Palestine. But there were some who said, what about Uganda or Grand Island near Buffalo? Or, maybe there's another place that would be a lot safer, easier to acquire. So that was part of the conversation in political Zionism, that the goal is the survival of the Jewish people. And because of the rising anti-Semitism right? This is in the 1880s. Pogroms, led to the mass migration to this country as well as to Israel. And then, so we're 70 years before the Holocaust already. And that was already the writing on the wall. So in the formation of the different forms of Zionism, so Kaplan was clearly in the camp of this cultural Zionism that specifically was about, was centered in the land of Israel, and that if there had to be a state, it would be a means to an end, not an end in of itself. And the end in of itself wouldn't just be survival, but the revitalization of this cultural, spiritual legacy of the Jewish people. So Kaplan was undeniably a Zionist. He was asked to be the first president of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He lived in Jerusalem for a time. I think he ended his life, at the end of his life, he moved to Jerusalem. He was invested in and supported the building and the state, creation of the state. And throughout his writings and that time period, and he lived 104 years or something like that. So he was around for a lot of it. He saw the establishment of the state, but his concern about the establishment of the state of Israel was in line with his concern with the liturgy of the Jewish people and around the tendency for nation states in the name of patriotism to become tribalistic and chauvinistic. So he was adamant that there had to be buffers or sort of safeguards put in place to prevent the state of Israel from becoming chauvinistic, right? Leading to a chauvinism, a sort of chosen people were better, holier than thou mentality. There was so he was a leading figure in framing Zionism for the diaspora. I remember, in one of the classes in rabbinical school, the professor drawing a wheel on I think probably a chalkboard, it might have been dry erase. And that this was Kaplan's image or metaphor for the Jewish people geographically, and that Israel was the hub, even before it was a state. The land of Israel had to be the hub of the Jewish people, and especially after the state was established. Remember, the Hebrew language, modern Hebrew, was already being revived before the establishment of the state, especially in the 20s and 30s, Eliezer ben Yehuda. So cultural revitalization in the land of Israel was already moving and generating a lot of energy before the establishment of the state. And that the wheel itself, the spokes, were the lines of communication and connection between the hub, which was Israel, and the diaspora, which was the wheel. So that was the way he framed the relationship between the homeland and the state and the community in the diaspora, American Jewry, Argentinian Jewry, Russian Jewry, etc. So there's no question about, for Kaplan and early Reconstructionism, the centrality of that aspiration to create a state in Israel. I'll pause for questions or comments.
I got a question.
Yeah.
The Orthodox, do they still believe that Jewish people are the chosen people? No.
That's a good question. So there's more diversity within Orthodoxy than there is the rest of Jewry. The ultra Orthodox to the modern Orthodox and so much in between. There are certainly mainstreams within Orthodoxy that will insist on a conventional theology of God literally chose the Jewish people to receive the Torah and to have this special and particular mission on earth. And for sure, in Orthodox congregations, the prayer book is the same, right? It uses the language of chosenness throughout the prayer book. And remember, Kaplan, much of his early audience, right, were Orthodox yeshiva kids who were struggling with some of the traditional notions about God, perhaps about chosenness, etc. Thank you. Bye, you guys. So it's to paint that sort of consistency of the concern about chosenness or chauvinism that extended both to liturgy and to the way of thinking about the land of Israel. Why would the establishment of a state and potentially be susceptible to exacerbating chauvinism, a sense of superiority?
Those other groups of people would claim that same piece of land.
Okay, so if especially if there's controversy around who has the right to the land, right? The claim of an inherent right or assertion of that right could entrench that sense of entitlement, right? Yeah.
Manifest destiny.
Manifest destiny, right? Yeah.
But, my understanding from our visit to Israel and everything we read now is that the Haredim, they're not really state oriented. My understanding is they don't really want to have anything to do with state other than to get their
Benefit checks and stuff like that. So Haredim are the ultra-Orthodox groups, and there, of course, a recent law passed requiring religious men and women who were previously exempt from army service to serve. Big controversy within in Israel, and especially among the Orthodox community. So a large portion of the ultra-Orthodox community have this belief that the performance of the mitzvot and the religiosity is driven in some ways by bringing about the advent of the Messiah, the time of Messianic age, and that the scripture, according to them, promises that it is the Messiah that will restore autonomy and sovereignty, Jewish sovereignty over the land. To preempt that is a form of idolatry and ashanda, right? So that's part of the theology behind the ultra-Orthodox not recognizing the state, not agreeing to serve in the state, not promoting the establishment of a state. That's what the Messiah is supposed to do, and we just observe the mitzvot to get the Messiah to come.
They don't have to work either. The government supports them.
There is a lot of government support. I wouldn't say they don't have to work, but there's a lot of subsidies for yeah.
When I was there, the guide was telling the group, and you could feel that he had so much animosity in for that reason.
Towards the Orthodox.
Yeah.
The exemptions and the dependency on the government, etc. Yeah. Okay. So that context. Then a little bit of history of the movement itself. I hope this isn't too boring. I feel like I'm talking a lot, but jump in if you have other questions. So the Reconstructionist movement began to be formed in the 50s, and with a handful of congregations, and then spread. And then in 65, I think, the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College was established in Philadelphia, deliberately not in New York, right? To move it out of under the have its own place anyway. And it was, again, the Reconstructionist movement was formed in opposition to Kaplan's desire. Kaplan did not want to create a new movement, but his students convinced him ultimately that that was the only way his ideas would get out, because they were being stifled and muted by the Orthodox, who excommunicated him for creating a new Haggadah. And then he was teaching in what became the conservative movement's seminary, which he taught how to give a sermon there for 40 years plus, and other classes. A quick anecdote, the Jewish Theological Seminary is what it's called now, has been for quite some time, that's where conservative rabbis primarily are trained. So when Kaplan was there teaching for right over 40 years, so he was constantly accused of being an atheist. And according to the anecdote, he was also the only professor that began every class with a prayer. Right? And it's a prayer from Ahava Rabba, help us, have compassion upon us, God, to learn and to teach and to do and to uphold with love all that we study of your Torah. That's sort of the translation of that prayer. So when the movement was established and the rabbinical schools established, so there was a requirement from the beginning for rabbinical students to spend at least a year in Israel. And that was still the case when I went there. And I spent 6 months before I started rabbinical school, that the rabbinical school required me to do because I didn't know Hebrew. And then during rabbinical school, I spent a full year in Jerusalem. And there's sort of always been, since I was there, a bit of tension around that requirement as things evolve. So there was in the 80s, I think in the early 80s, there was one of the presidents of the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College said, you know what, I'm going to invite to teach, be professor at the Rabbinical College, anyone who is doing something new and innovative in the Jewish North American world. So two figures in particular were brought to the Rabbinical College. The Rabbi Zalman Schechter Shlomi, who some may know because spent much of his life and professional life in Boulder. Reb Zalman is the founder of the Jewish Renewal Movement. And then another leader named Arthur Waskow. Art Waskow was the author of the Freedom Seder, which was the first social justice-oriented adaptation of the Seder that was created. And they were both, and he was a hardcore peace activist in the 60s, and early on, quite vocal about the establishment of a Palestinian state and sort of pro-Palestinian rights. And so they were both brought to the Rabbinical College and to teach because of this Reconstructionist investment in innovation. And the board of directors of the Rabbinical College couldn't stomach Art Waskow's pro-Palestinian, sort of we'll call radical left-wing politics around the state of Israel, actively criticizing the state of Israel for the occupation and the settlements and things like that. And Reb Zalman, that was challenging for that group because of his emphasis on experiencing God, right? The experiential, mystical chanting and the fervor of prayer. Whereas, as you can imagine, the early generations of Reconstructionists were pretty rational types, right? Intellectual integrity, and this is what that was a big thrust of Kaplan, even though he was a firebrand sermon giver too. So so they were asked to leave. They created a new movement. They were both in Philadelphia. They realized they had some overlap, and they created the Jewish Renewal Movement together. And ever since, there's been this sort of the question about how much the umbrella inclusivity approach of the Reconstructionist movement, how much it could tolerate of a variety of perspectives on Israel and Zionism, especially post 67, once you have the occupation, right? Not annexing, but the Israel taking over militarily the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, right? So once Israel became no longer a victim like of the Holocaust, but had won, right, the War of Independence and the 67 Six-Day War and the Yom Kippur War in 73, and demonstrated its power, and that it also revealed that it could be an oppressor, an oppressive state, right? So so this controversy within the movement around how big the umbrella is, how inclusive in terms of the range of political views, especially regarding Israel, has been there since the 60s, 70s. The most recent expression of that is that the movement's policy, when I was in the rabbinical school in the 90s, so I was there for 7 years, I had a lot more to learn, that it was unquestionably a sort of Zionist, right? We still had the requirement to spend a full year in Israel. There was certainly maybe a space for one of the rabbis that I shadowed was involved in pro-Palestinian leadership and had to leave his congregation and start a new congregation that was specifically, would accept his politics. That was in Philadelphia too. But the majority of the college and the professors were all, many of them were from Israel. I would say strongly Zionist, though I would say cultural Zionist with ambivalence about political Zionism. Is that fair to say? Following me? Okay. And then, but then we had when these progressive sort of pro-Palestinian or might say a strong criticism of Israel, when groups started to form in the 90s and in the 2000s, rabbis for human rights in Israel, and then rabbis for human rights in North America, eventually the BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanction movement. When there were rabbinic leadership of those groups, there was a high proportion of Reconstructionist rabbis in those groups. And they were driven by this sort of social justice and equality and wanting Israel to live up to its ideals of equality and justice, right, for all. That's sort of written into the Declaration of Independence of Israel. And so the movement started to develop a reputation as critical of Israel, non-Zionist or anti-Zionist. And as a result of that reputation, even though it was a small minority of Reconstructionist rabbis, but because the rabbis who were part of those groups were mostly all Reconstructionists. They're Rabbis for Human Rights, which is, I think, a wonderful organization. I volunteered with them. They do things like protest the demolition of Palestinian homes that doesn't seem to be with any cause, or go to Palestinian olive orchards and harvest the olives when the Palestinians who own that land would be at risk of being attacked from settlers that live nearby. And so they do things to sort of around the safeguarding of it. They're not criticizing or questioning the right of Israel to exist as a state, but they're actively advocating for equality and justice and uplifting the injustices that Palestinians may be suffering. So that group on its leadership, board, and it's for like 24 or 30 rabbis, was like more than half Reconstructionist rabbis. So the reputation of the Reconstructionist movement, which was not very well known, became well known through those more vocal, politically active representatives from the movement. And so applying to the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, you have a new generation who basically have only known Benjamin Netanyahu as the prime minister of Israel. They weren't around when, Rabin and others were leading active efforts, Camp David, and trying to create a peace process. So their perception of Israel, their experience of Israel was really as an oppressive state and adopting, narratives from academic circles and, pro-Palestinian circles that were highly critical of Israel, even questioning its legitimacy. So those who were interested in serving the Jewish people as rabbis, and maybe on the social activist side, and certainly the left wing of the Jewish American population, openly criticizing or questioning the even legitimacy, were drawn to the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College because they had all these, because the rabbis that they knew on those sort of left wing groups were Reconstructionist rabbis for the most part. So when I was in Philadelphia this May, I went to the graduation. When you've been in when you've survived being a rabbi for 25 years, the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College gives you an honorary doctorate. So I was there to receive an honorary doctorate, 25th anniversary of graduating there. And right before the graduation, the weekend before, there was an article in a major Jewish press that was interviewing students who had dropped out of the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College because as Zionists, they felt like their views weren't welcome. So that the culture at the Rabbinical College had shifted, at least among the student body, if not the faculty, to feel like it was, those who held more Zionistic pro-Israel views were in the minority. And so it was a big to-do in terms of controversy, and the president who spoke at the graduation had to address that as part of the graduation, reiterate that the Reconstructionist movement is a Zionist still remains a Zionist organization, but we don't use one's views on the state of Israel as a litmus test for admitting candidates for the rabbinate. That's what is the official policy. Anyway, so this has created a whole, sort of you're protected, most of you are protected from it, but in my world, the Reconstructionist Rabbinical Association, it's really a taboo topic, right? Like a charged matter, because for those of us who while remain maybe cultural or spiritual Zionists, feel strongly that the survival of not just the Jewish body, but the Jewish soul is dependent upon, in this time, in this generation, a strong Jewish state, right? That protects itself and its citizens. And that those who are critiquing that are really threatening the Jewish, existence. And so, it's an existential thing. It's not something that you can, I like saying chosenness when I say the Kiddush, and I don't like, there's not a lot at stake in those kinds of questions, but around one's view about the state of Israel, there is a whole lot of charge, right? It's, they were just doing a teacher workshop for our Hebrew school teachers and the teen volunteers, and talking about like the three parts of our brain, right? That we're in like survival mode or emotional mode or sort of, rational, executive thinking, right? So the question around Zionism takes us right to that survival, limbic system that it makes it hard to have open and dialogue. Let me pause. What are you questions or thinking around that? Is that surprising? Is it
Overwhelming.
overwhelming? It seems overwhelming. Yeah. So
How has the war changed or not changed? That?
so the war, of course, has exacerbated dramatically that fissure, right? That friction that was already there, that undercurrent. You know, in terms of the protests and the sit-ins at DC and things like that, that there's just so the Reconstructionist Rabbinical Association meets now every other year since COVID, every other year. Julie, I just noticed your hand. I don't know if you've had it up for a while, but
No, just actually thinking because the way I understand it, some of the tenets of Reconstructionism are to listen and to move into a modernist Jewish tradition. How modernist is this? Like, what do you think is actually going to happen with the Reconstructionists from the top if they're listening to the people that are studying and then becoming rabbis from Reconstructionism? This is where, let's say, 75 or 85% of the people are coming from. Are we supposed to adapt to that kind of modernism, just like Kaplan adapted to modernism?
oh, well, right. I mean, it's I think so. Those on the sort of non-Zionist or even anti-Zionist camp within the Reconstructionist movement are making that claim, like that we no longer, the Jewish people no longer needs the state of Israel as a Jewish state to endure, right? So that's the evolving, right? In Kaplan's time, it might have been necessary and certainly central to that image of Jewish civilization and the health of it, the vibrancy, right? Every other ethnic group, civilization has land, language, and literature, right? Story. But the Jewish people has gone without land and largely without language, you know, without being Hebrew speaking for 2,000 years. So they would argue that while at Kaplan's time, it might have been central importance, but times are evolving and maybe, you know, a diaspora Judaism is all we need, or that we don't need a state with a majority, a Jewish state, in other words. So that's the argument they would make, but I think those and I hope I'm addressing your question, Julie, that in terms of, you know, so the question of the evolution of Judaism is, I think, remains constant in the various camps around the views towards Israel. There's a sense of needing to evolve. Kaplan needed to evolve when political Zionism sort of won the day and became, after the Holocaust especially, you know, the only, you know, real option, right? The sense that we need our own state, right? When ships of refugees were being turned away from every continent, okay, clearly we need our own state, right? It was not a matter of, you know, Kaplan had to adopt that that framework that yes, a state was necessary. So you can, it depends on how you see the trajectory, where we're evolving, on how you would navigate that.
Where does
What's that?
where does the university stand on requiring time in Israel now?
Oh, so it's no longer required.
See,
It
that
is
just blows my mind. I don't see
Yeah.
how any Jew can not experience Israel as part of their overall education.
Yeah, and so here's where we get into a tension between, right, these sort of two primary values that foundational to Reconstructionism, One is the inclusivity, right? That there's lots of ways to do and be Jewish, right? Yiddish theater, civil rights activism, observe Shabbat and the holidays, keep kosher, and and live a sort of frum Haredi life, right? Those are all different, and the movement wanted to try to value each of them and not, right, chauvinistically create a hierarchy of this is super Jew and bad Jew, right? So if you hold to that framework and prioritize inclusivity in a sort of large tent, then it's hard to say, oh, you can't be Jewish if you haven't been to Israel, or you can't be a rabbi, a leader of the Jewish people if you haven't been to Israel, or find Israel central. So you have the tension between this inclusivity value and the big tent, and the vision of the Jewish civilization as requiring land and language and the need for the centrality of the state, competing with one another, right? And so the war has certainly exacerbated that, as you see, yarmulke wearing Jews attending the encampments, right? And protesting the war in Gaza, calling for an immediate ceasefire, things like that. So so that because the current war has cast a spotlight on the suffering of Palestinians and the military power of Israel, that power differential. So it's exacerbated that fissure within the Jewish world about how to,
Visiting Israel is more than just about going to the state, it's the history.
right.
Just like Christians go to Israel.
That's right. And the Rabbinical College makes the case, that case exactly, to all of its students, that they should spend time in Israel, and gives them all sorts of options. A summer, or we used to require a year, but it's not requiring students as a condition for graduation. So it's still urged, and there's still a coordinator for rabbinical students in Israel, but it's not required anymore, and that's part of a response to this demographic shift of who's attending through the college. So it's a different kind of Judaism, right? So on the one hand, so these vocally anti-Zionist rabbis are giving Jews who are drawn to that form of expression, political expression, a way to do it Jewishly. It just seems like an anathema to those of us who are like, wait, what is Judaism without Israel these days, right? And how can we ensure the survival? I think there's a case to be made to move out of our limbic system, right? We survived for 2,000 years without Israel. If Israel wasn't a Jewish state, my guess is we would continue to survive if we continue to reconstruct and do functional value revaluation, which is the dogma. It's the process, there's a dogma or a conviction around the process, not around the results, right? So you should have a way of you should struggle with and invest in your relationship to God, whatever that means. We're not going to tell you what the end result is. Same with Israel, right? It's the process of Israel has been a central theme, of course, in Jewish history and Jewish liturgy and Jewish scripture throughout Jewish history. You have to wrestle with it. You have to engage it somehow. You can't ignore it. But we're not going to tell you what your opinion should be at the end of that process. And so it's really taken that principle to its extreme, and this is part of the consequence of that. That's a fascinating thing for me. Yeah.
Of the pro-Palestinian labor movements or whatever protests. What is their solution to the difficulty? Yeah, what are they proposing? Anything other than Israel should stop doing something? What is their proposal in support of the Palestinians? I mean, what is their notion?
Yeah. I haven't, again, every person has their own, so I haven't seen a consistent sort of, this is the argument of the anti-Zionist rabbis or, leaders. There's not any one. My sense is, and I know and I'm friends with several of them, leader in the movement, that these are not pragmatists by and large, but ideologically driven, right? That and that is in line with Kaplan. He was very ideologically driven, right? They're not pragmatically looking for a political solution, but they have maybe we could say it this way, they're intolerant of the state that is representing the Jewish people, of doing something they regard as immoral, right? And again, you can debate about, war crimes and, the bombardment of Gaza. Julie, yes.
I was thinking about what you talked about last week, and I'm wondering if this is a connection of belonging as more important than Zionism and the Reconstructionist tenets of belonging that you talked so much about last week, and that's really the crux of this part of the Judaism of Reconstructionism, superseding Zionism.
Superseding Zionism. Well, if one's
if
view
it
on
needs to be
Zionism,
one or the other, not that they have to be, and that they can be and both, but that the belonging to them is more critical.
Thank you. That's incredibly helpful and insightful, Julie, to put that in the language of the phrase that we use, that Reconstructionism puts a sense of belonging before belief and behavior, right? So if you put one's belief or ideological convictions about Israel and Zionism under the belief category, you're going to make that secondary. That's not the litmus test for being a part of the Jewish people, right? Inclusive. So anyway, so I thought this was important. In some ways it feels like a bit of an esoteric internal Reconstructionist rabbi debate. But as part of a Reconstructionist congregation, you might be exposed to, Reconstructionists, aren't you anti-Zionist? If their only impression is from, a forward, an article they read in the forward, or some other place where if the only encounter with a Reconstructionist rabbi or leadership was as part of a leader representative in the BDS movement or, JVP. JVP is, I want to say a word about Jewish Voice for Peace. I think it's singular. Jewish Voice for Peace, JVP, is a prominent, has a prominent role in the encampment movement, the ceasefire movement, and they have defined Zionism as decidedly colonialist and racist, like Zionism is colonialist and racist, then that's where you get the, if it's that way, then the campaign is, genocidal, etc. And many groups, including the Facebook group Evergreen Coalition for Racial Justice, has adopted their definition of Zionism as assuming that's the Jewish definition for Zionism. And that has led to some significantly consequential frictures between the anti-Black racism folks and the Jewish community, especially mainstream Jewish community. I've spent a lot of time this year trying to convince those groups and some others that JVP, Jewish Voice for Peace, is a fringe Jewish voice. And most of my colleagues, Reconstructionist colleagues, reject and are not part of JVP. Now, we do have members of Beth Evergreen who are part of JVP and sort of agree, or whatever, have aligned with themselves with that movement. So that is a challenging piece. It's again, it tests the how big the tent can stretch, right? Do we, in my conversation with Israelis, Reconstructionist rabbis who are in Israel, and I've been meeting every morning reciting Psalms with a group of Reconstructionist rabbis and a handful of other folks who recite Psalms every morning since the war broke out. And so I'm having regular conversations with them, and of course they are baffled by the American Jewish involvement in the encampments and in the anti-Israel rhetoric, and deeply pained by it. So anyway, it's sort of an interesting time, right, where we're seeing that there's this teaching in Musar that if you don't place a limit on loving kindness, right, and acceptance, ultimately you will, how's it go? You will cause harm to those whom you profess to love. So there's a piece about setting limits. It's like, you're not going to express compassion for the person who perpetrated a rape to the rape victim. That's not kind. Even though you might say, well, let's have some compassion for the rapist, the perpetrator. That's chesed. But when you do that in front of the person who's a victim, that's not kindness, right? So for me, that principle has a role in this, that there may be some boundaries, right, around that. And that certainly, informed my decision-making around this as the war has progressed. And, I get my inbox filled with sign this ceasefire petition and, doing videos and things like that, trying to get, and I've not been, I've resisted that. But it does create a fine line to walk. Right here at Beth Evergreen, we want folks to have a sense of belonging, right? Whether they are, deeply pained and their primary concern is for the, that they prioritize the concern for, you could say, Palestinian lives or the moral treatment by the Jewish state of the minorities within their state or within their the territories, that's their primary concern. more so than, wiping out Hamas, getting hostages back, protecting and safeguarding the citizens, Jewish and non-Jewish, in the state of Israel. So it's just a matter of priorities. So we're trying to create a space where they can have a community, Jewish community, but also to do that without deeply offending, Israelis and those of us who have more stronger Zionist views, pro-Israel sort of views. Just looking at the time. Okay, we got about 20 minutes or so. Maybe open it up for, and it doesn't have to be specific to this topic, this question, but around Reconstructionism and its relevance, and there's a presidential election coming up. Remember, the part of the principles of Reconstructionist approach are living fully in two civilizations, right? In American and Jewish civilization. So what does Reconstructionist Jewish approach have to inform us about engagement in American politics and, things? Is another legitimate question, right? Indeed, we know from, freedom riders and many, folks found their primary expression of their Jewish values by engaging in civil rights and advocacy for, civil rights for Black Americans. So we have that legacy as well. So opening it up, any questions about what we've talked about over the last few weeks?
I wanted to comment on this concept of putting belonging before believing and behaving. And with a little anecdote about my pseudo stepsister and her children. She's Jewish, from Jewish parents, my stepsister, and she has adult children who have been always weird, to use Tim Walt's term. They're just friends. They're just strange kids. And two of them are twins. And they're just, anyway, and we had a huge blow up in the family because they posted on their Facebook page caricatures of Jews as Nazis with big noses and all that kind of stuff. And I get the sense, the thing that bothers me about putting belonging before believing is there are so many kids, especially, who are alienated, don't feel part of something, and they're susceptible to groups that are, for lack of a better term, evil or just, and so you kind of touched on it when you said how wide do you accept, belonging and all that, but I don't think I have a hard time accepting that just because someone wants to belong that I have to adhere and accept that. Because I think people that belong to those groups, or whether it's ultra MAGA, I think there's some of that on that side too, where people feel alienated and all of a sudden they have a group that they belong to.
Yeah.
So I guess that's, we're outsiders here and just trying to educate ourselves, but I think that's kind of a little bit of a sharp thing for me to say that belonging tops everything.
Yeah, that's helpful. I think that's true. There's, a lot of, before I entered rabbinical school, I would have said, Christianity is about belief and Judaism is about behavior, right? Creed versus deed, or as it were, right? So you assess one's moral, you know, strength or merit based on behavior, not about what you believe or what you say, right? So that was certainly where I was coming from. I think in some way that formulation of putting belonging before believing and behaving is trying to give more emphasis to an aspect of communal life and spiritual life that had been neglected, the belonging piece. You know, the other principle that went along with belonging was about peoplehood. And I think Kaplan's faith was that if one was truly felt a belonging as part of a group, that meant a certain degree of accountability of behavior and that and action to remain part of that group. You know, sort of the yeah, I think maybe this is perhaps a short-sighted piece, that if you don't have the guardrails on belief, right, whether it's, you know, belief in the value or the legitimacy of the state of Israel, for instance, or behavior around, you know, sort of refraining from demonizing the other party in language or, you know, in action, condemning Hamas's attack, right? That those sorts of things could be, those guardrails are necessary to retain a sense of belonging. And it can go off the rails if you don't have any mutual corrective or something guiding those behaviors and beliefs. So yeah, I think that's a legitimate risk. It's not one to the exclusion of the others. But I think when I talked to the group of teachers today, I was saying, you know, we're not trying to convince all the kids in our religious school to, you know, believe in a transnatural God or to practice Shabbat, you know, or keep kosher. But we want them to learn about those things, and through that learning to feel a sense of belonging, so that the behaviors and the stories and the Bible stories, etc., are there as a means to foster a sense of belonging. So that's the intent, I think. That's the sort of that formulation. Yeah, so I think you know, the other line of questioning that we can do, if this, you know, if there's sort of not more questions about the Zionism in Israel piece. Well, I was going to say earlier that the Reconstructionist Rabbinical Association, the group of rabbis that are Reconstructionist affiliated, which includes not just people who graduated from the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, but people who graduated from other rabbinical schools but have decided that they'd rather be a Reconstructionist. And that, so then the group met this past February, March in Atlanta. And because this is such a challenging topic within the Reconstructionist movement, because you have such, I mean, you have the hardcore hawk, you know, Zionist, even pro Netanyahu Zionist, you know, and as you heard, the sort of far left, that it's sort of been a third rail issue in the Reconstruction movement. We haven't talked about it, right? It's been truly a taboo topic within the movement. So at this convention, 4-day convention, so 2 days were spent on this topic. And I think that actually the movement did a really brilliant and careful job at doing it. And one of the things which I'll share with you that helped open up the conversation, because we all have families where weird families, family members with a variety, is to when before you get into a debate about Zionism or Israel the Gaza current war, to ask each other, what's at stake for you in this conversation?
Mhm.
Right, and in that exercise, so it's over 100, maybe 150 or so of us. So you had like, is it personal, right? You have family there, you live there, etc. Is it spiritual, religious? Is it about, Judaism or the soul, or or moral, principles, or is it peoplehood, or is it the political? And so each of us are going to have, it's probably a combination of those, but what's sort of top of your list? And that having that clarity for yourself and about the other person can vastly potentially help that conversation, prevent it from eroding into, right? See if different things at stake, then. So one of the things I did was, after the first full day, they said, is there any other conversations, or groups that you want to convene? And I said, I would like a group that was talked about, that brought together Zionists, non-Zionists, and anti-Zionists in the same room to talk to one another, because the first groupings were grouped with the people who have the same stake, articulation of stake. I want to hear. So I assembled a group of, so there was like 2 non-Zionists, an anti-Zionist, and I think there were 3 Zionists of us. It was a smaller group, but we got to hear from each other and wanted to, find out. So the non-Zionist was, as you can imagine, it just wasn't, didn't regard the enterprise of the state of Israel as central to their Jewish life, and didn't think it needed to be for the future of the Jewish people. The anti-Zionist was against the Jewish state as an ethnocentric state, right? As a Jewish majority having power over a large minority of a different ethnic group. That they didn't call it apartheid, but I think that's what they were thinking. So they wouldn't have entertained that question of pragmatically, how do we win the war? Because they would have said, do away with the Jewish state and have it just be a democratic state. I mean, that's also has problems, pragmatic view, but that's sort of what they were saying. So they were against the establishment, and they bought the narrative that it was a colonialist, absurd narrative.
The question I would ask, what would it take for the Palestinian community to accept a democratic state? That would be the question I have. How would you get
I think
them to agree to a ceasefire, or to agree to share the land?
Yeah. I don't think it would be hard to get the Palestinian population in Israel to agree to the expanding the borders to include the West Bank and Gaza. They would just wait out a couple decades in which there'd be a non-Jewish majority, and then they could elect a new governor, and they could enact a Palestinian right of return, and then you have hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees coming into the land, and then you have a Jewish minority again in Palestine. So they would accept that. They just wait out the fact that was an inevitable, which is the reason why, of course, pragmatically, we still have occupied territories, because Israel knows they can't annex the West Bank without granting citizenship and grant citizenship to the citizens of to the people of the West Bank and Gaza within a decade or two losing a majority and not having claims, the ability to preserve the foundational principles of the democracy, a Jewish place of refuge, etc. So anyway, that's the bind. Yeah.
So that to me is the argument in the fallacy. Because you can, but the presumption is you couldn't convince the Palestinians to live in a democratic state. They would just wait it out till they could make it something else. What would it take for the people to convince the people to have their own state? You can't even do that.
Yeah.
These are the questions I would ask the pro-Palestinian
Right.
Jewish community.
You know,
How does this play out?
you know the old saying, the Palestinians never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity. And Alice and I had some experience with the Palestinian mindset because 9 years ago, we hosted a Palestinian exchange student from the West Bank, from Jenin. He lived with us for almost a year, went to school, delightful kid, extremely bright, from a great family. His mother is a dentist, his father is a prosecutor. Farouk used to joke, my father's put more Palestinians in jail than the Israelis have, you know. But, you know, I keep thinking back to, I'm always quoting movie lines, and if you remember Men in Black, the very first Men in Black, when Tommy Lee Jones is explaining to Will Smith that there's all these aliens here. And Will Smith goes, well, why don't we just tell the people? People are smart. And he goes, yes, a person is smart. People are dumb, panicky, you know what, and I feel almost the same way like a Palestinian, when I speak to an individual Palestinian, they're smart, they're rational and all that. But the collective mindset is, it's just so destructive. And the things they do, that they sing the Palestinian national anthem at his school every day, and they recite, I mean, they spend a good deal, a significant amount of time. I mean, we give the Pledge of Allegiance, right? But it's kind of perfunctory, but this is a big part of their day, every single day.
Yeah.
And
building of a national identity. Yeah, no, that's right. And all right, so you get the sense of the, you know, the foundation of where it comes from, and a little bit of the painting of the current reality. I mean, I left that conversation in some ways baffled, right? And not really understanding how they could come to the conclusion, especially as Reconstructionists, that they do. But also, it was a cordial conversation, and there was certainly mutual goodwill. Yeah. The question around what does it mean for the future of the Reconstructionist movement and what niche it plays in the Jewish world, and how its relationship to Israel and Zionism will be a part of that, since that's becoming more of a defining characteristic, right, of how it's labeled. That's an interesting question to me, and how that might impact CVE.
I'm sorry, it's labeled.
It's labeled as sort of anti-Zionist.
Oh, okay.
Right. You know, on the other hand, you could say it gets labeled as, you know, radically invested in protecting Palestinian rights. I mean, there's multiple ways to measure that, or to frame it. Yeah. So, yeah, Gary.
So slightly off that subject, but you were mentioning that in this organization you belong to, that there's lots of rabbis that do learn the Reconstructionist college, but they consider themselves Reconstructionist rabbis. So what does it take to become a Reconstructionist rabbi, to call oneself, I mean, a Reconstructionist rabbi? Because it seems like, if the movement is growing and you have lots of people becoming Reconstructionist rabbis, you know, eventually there's gonna be a mindset amongst those rabbis that change the thinking for their students and their communities. So I guess today, what does it take to be called a Reconstruction rabbi?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, first, it's the Reconstructionist movement is still by far very small in comparison to the Reform or Conservative movements. You know, my graduating class was 10 people. That's a large class of rabbis, you know, in terms of the history. I think there were seven or eight graduates this year.
And most of them did not go into rabbinical congregation work.
Yes, and most,
That's the
certainly
other
the right,
piece.
those, you know, those who are professedly anti-Zionist aren't serving congregations
Right.
primarily. They're doing other kinds of work or, you know, involvement. What is it called to come, what does it take to be called the Reconstructionist rabbi? I think that will vary. Essentially, it means sort of an acknowledgement or sort of adopting the Reconstructionist process, right? The sort of Kaplanian, Mordecai Kaplan's framework for, you know, Judaism as a civilization and the evolving religious civilization, that formulation. So, but there, and there are others who, for different reasons, are disenfranchised from the movement where they ordained, right? Whether they, you know, they were a part of the conservative movement, but they came out as gay, and there's just not as welcoming a community in the conservative movement, so they come to the Reconstructionist movement and find a home there. So it's usually about a sense of belonging, or maybe they, you know, because of their, they were in the Reform movement, but they became observant, strictly observant of kosher or Shabbat. And so you can find that in the Reconstructionist movement, that you're not, you know, it's not using halakha, but a place where there might be a welcoming of a more observant lifestyle, something like that. You know, before the rabbinical college was established, you had all of these students of Mordecai Kaplan who were conservative rabbis, but described themselves as Reconstructionists, right? Because there wasn't a Reconstructionist rabbinical college, but they were students of Kaplan and you know.
So if you're a rabbi or ordained in some form or other, you
Yeah.
can call yourself whatever you want.
No, there's a process for someone who didn't go to the rabbinical college, Reconstructionist rabbinical college, to become a part of the Reconstructionist Rabbinical Association. They have to do an interview process and make sure that they're in good standing, you know, as a rabbi, and they do a background check, you know, references and things like that. And they have to make a case why they would contribute to the Reconstructionist Rabbinical Association. Yeah, there's a process for doing that. It's not just, yeah.
I'm curious about whether the other movements have a requirement about spending time in Israel.
So I think the Reform movement, it still has the first year of their rabbinic program is in Israel. And the conservative movement, I don't know if it had that requirement. I don't think it did, but again, it has. I studied at the conservative yeshiva in Israel for my year, and the Hebrew University when I was in Israel for the year. So they have a program in Israel that you can go, but it's not a required thing. There were more Reconstructionist rabbi students than conservative rabbinical students. Yeah. So, you know, I think early on, maybe what defined Reconstructionism was around the egalitarian thing and role of women, and, you know, especially among the conservative, or among the Reform, like Rami Shapiro, being drawn to Reconstructionism, though he went to the Reform Rabbinical School. And it might be that they went to the Reform Rabbinical School, like, I think because it was more established. It probably had better paying jobs when you got out of the job, so it could have been a career decision, even though they were Kaplanian, when they entered, so there's some of those. But, so it's, as the social issue of the time has evolved, right, the role of women, inclusion of gay and lesbian, and women rabbis in the, the 70s and 80s. When I was there were 3 of the 10 of us that were straight. Right, so the majority of my class was gay or bisexual. When in rabbinical school, so that was sort of what was drawn, and because it took a decade, but the Reconstructionism was on the leading edge of formulating why we should, as a community, welcome and create rituals and embrace sexual orientation and diversity, at that time. So then it got that reputation, and then folks who identified that way were drawn to that school. So now it's around criticism of Israel or Zionism, anti-Zionism was strong. So and that, again, there were people saying, you can't possibly accept gays as rabbis. That's not Jewish, right? What's the difference between that and you can't possibly be anti-Zionist and Jewish, right? On the one hand, it's, it's a belief that's sort of, so the social issues are really, which surprised me, because I went because I was studying Mordecai Kaplan, and not because of the social issues I was drawn, to, and but anyway.
Well, it's a question then as to whether if the movement has profited from accepting more different kinds of people, is that going to turn out to be true in terms of accepting people who have different views about Zionism?
Right.
And
Yeah.
including those people.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly. Yeah.
It may be a step forward too.
I do think that the classes, were very, very small, and have now gotten bigger because you have, if you're an anti-Zionist and you want to go to rabbinical school, it's really the only place that will do that, right? Just like if you were openly gay and you wanted to go to rabbinical school in the 80s and 90s, you went to RC, Reconstructionist rabbinical. So it is increasing the enrollment and, in rabbinical college. It's interesting. And you can see there's a generational, rift or sort of gaps, around it, because the early generation of Reconstructionist rabbis, most of whom are still around, are strong Zionists, right? And emphasize that. All right, I notice we're getting folks falling asleep at the wheel and signing off on Zoom.
Thank you very much.
So pause. I really appreciate you engaging the conversation, and thanks for your interest. And there's of course much more, and I encourage you to read Embracing Judaism, as that's a really accessible, readable introduction to Reconstructionist thought and history. And to think about how, we as a congregation are using these processes and values and managing them. But, as we wrestle with questions like, how to best do security in the synagogue, and, what to do on Israel Independence Day, or, the ways we commemorate and mark. I want to do a commemoration on the anniversary of October 7th this year, right? But I want to do it inclusive, but I also, sort of what boundaries to set, and those are interesting questions that, but I hope, as they're going to upset certain, people on either fringe or either end of the spectrum, that at least we have some people who understand the decision-making process that goes into it. And what are the values that I'm trying to hold up as we make those tough decisions. All right, friends. Thank you. We'll see you next time. Thank you, guys.
You.
Thank you.